My name is Kurt Wise, a professor at 𝘎𝘕 University in Cleveland, Georgia. I want to address the question of the history of humanity. There are two different stories that are common in our culture, in our subculture perhaps. The biblical story of human history is very different from the evolutionary view of human history. And I want to look at one specific kind of evidence for history and how it applies to those two ideas. And that is the history of mitochondrial DNA. I'll explain what that is in a moment. First of all, I want to go over briefly the biblical view of Earth history. It is a radically different view of history than we are used to in the evolutionary story. First of all, it doesn't occupy very much time compared to the evolutionary story. It begins about 6,000 years ago with two people, Adam and Eve, according to Genesis 1, Genesis 2. And what the Bible recounts is that there is a period of 1,656 years or so, depending on what text you use. The commonly used text would say 1,656 years, where population apparently just uniformly increased, probably in an exponential fashion. Doesn't tell us exactly that, but we can infer that that's probably what happened. Probably producing some millions or so people on the earth. Then Scripture tells us that the flood occurs and drops the population down to 8. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their respective wives. Then there is a period of time that we estimate to be about 300 years or so, about 3 centuries, between the flood and the Tower of Babel, where humans stayed together in one population. Probably the population increased again exponentially, but it's obviously a much shorter period of time, so it doesn't reach as high a value as we see in the pre-flood time. Then Scripture tells us that at Babel, population is divided, as God gives apparently each family group a different language in such a way that they cannot interact with, communicate with other family groups. And so the different family groups disperse out from Babel. They each become independent groups, growing in population separately from the others, at least for a large number of generations. So Scripture would tell us that we can infer from Scripture that then the population increases probably exponentially from there up to the present time, with obviously some losses from wars and that sort of thing, but for the most part, an exponential growth. Again, this is it's actually a very specific story of Earth history that is, and we're going to see that it's important that it drops down at one point to a small number, in particular 3 females. That's going to be important for the story. And that's very different from the evolutionary story, which has humans existing for at least 1,000 times longer. So whatever the timeline is for humanity in the biblical scenario, the evolutionary scenario would say humans have been here 1,000 times longer than that, and that's as humans. Now, genetically, they would have inherited information from organisms that lived for millions, hundreds of millions of years before that. But just focusing on humans, it's going to be 1,000 times deeper in time than this one. So evolutionary history begins, actually Homo sapiens sapiens begins about 100,000 years ago or so. Homo sapiens, the species, that's Homo sapiens sapiens, is probably about 100,000 years ago. Homo sapiens as a species, about let's say 1/3 of a million years ago, The genus Homo begins about 2 million years ago. They, of course, according to evolution, are descendant from primates that would have begun somewhere around 65 million years ago. Mammalia, the primates are, of course, mammals. There would have been an early mammal from which the primates supposedly evolved. That would have been about 200 million years ago. The mammals are supposed to have been derived from reptiles, and before them amphibians, before them the fish, and so vertebrates would have been beginning about 500 million years ago. And then the vertebrates would have come from invertebrates, stretching that back to at least 600 million years before present. So very much deeper history and time for the evolutionary scenario. Now, a little bit of information about what mitochondrial DNA is. In the animals, and I previous slide, I stopped this at animals. Animals would have been descendant from non-animals, from protists before that. But our story is going to begin with Animalia, because it's the animal cells that contain mitochondria, and everybody from there on out has mitochondria. Humans have inherited mitochondria according to evolution from the primates, and them from the mammals before them from the vertebrates before them, and then from the invertebrates before them. And it's in the mitochondria of individual cells, which are called the energy factories of the cell. The mitochondria produces the energy that the cell needs to do all of its activities. It more or less takes sugar, breaks the sugar down into its component parts, releasing the energy, sort of like producing electricity for the cell in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Interestingly enough, the mitochondria have their own DNA. When we think of DNA of organisms, we usually think of what's called nuclear DNA, and DNA that's in the nucleus of the cell. And we often ignore the additional DNA that's found in mitochondria and in chloroplasts. There are a few cell organelles that actually contain their own DNA. So that DNA changes independently of and operates independently of the nuclear DNA. So in this talk, I'm going to be focusing on the mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is a string in humans of 16,500 or so nucleotides. That's a series of nucleotides, 16,569 long. About a little over a third of them can mutate, can change from one nucleotide to another nucleotide without decimating making the mitochondrial DNA of no use. These mutable portions of the DNA mutate at roughly one every 3 generations, a mutation every 3 generations or so. And those mutations are then inherited by the subsequent mitochondria, and you can actually use those mutations that you find in populations of organisms to reconstruct a history of that population. But what's interesting about this is so for example, we have an evolutionary tree or family tree of something, doesn't matter what it is, and we find that in 3 of these fellers there's a particular mutation that none of the others have. Here's one that 4 of them have a particular mutation. Here's one where 3 plus 4 plus 2, 9 of them have one mutation that no one else has, and then of those, two of them have an additional mutation. And if you just had the population, didn't know anything about the history back here, and you had this information about what what mutations the various organisms have, you can very often work out this kind of a family tree, reconstructing the history of that particular set of organisms. Now, the thing about this that's kind of interesting is that mitochondria only comes from the mother, nothing from the father, because when in humans in particular, most mammals, most animals, it would be the case, you've got an egg cell that is fertilized by sperm. The egg cell has all of the components that the cells of the adult would have, including the mitochondria. It's fertilized by a sperm from the father, but the only thing the sperm actually contributes to this is the sperm's DNA. The rest of the sperm, and there are mitochondria in the sperm, but the egg will not allow the mitochondria from the sperm into the egg. Therefore, the only thing the father donates is his DNA. So the mitochondrial DNA, which is in the mitochondria, do not come from the father to the child. They only come from the mother. And so mitochondrial DNA traces out the history of females. So it's not a history of the males of the population, but the females. And that's going to be interesting for our story. Now, let's return to the broad view of evolutionary history. What is the history of humans, specifically females, in an evolutionary scenario? This is more or less the representation of the mitochondrial DNA tree, or what we might expect. Because what each of these vertical lines represent would be one lineage of people that has not interbred with other people. You think on the present Earth, with people spread all over the planet, that the fossil record indicates that very early in the development of humans, namely about 2 million years ago in conventional dating, they had already spread to the farthest points of the Earth, at least the farthest points of the old world. And so the people that did that, people that, let's say, ended up in Spain, are not from then on probably going to be interbreeding with people that ended up in Eastern Asia, or those that ended up in Southern Africa. And so one can imagine there were probably thousands of populations across the world that once they were established, something in the order of 1 million years ago, they have never interbred with any other population around the world. So there's probably thousands of these individual trees. And although the trees, if you blew this up and looked at each of these vertical lines very carefully, you'd see, oh, look, there's an evolutionary tree within that. But at this scale, we would expect there to be probably thousands, at least hundreds, of individual human lineages that did not interbreed with other lineages. And they would have done so for thousands of generations. If a generation of humans is, let's say, 20 years, just to make it easy to figure out, this is only 20,000 years of time. Humans have been around for longer than that, if it's just 1,000 generations. If every 3 generations there's a mutation, we would expect thousands of mutations within each lineage across hundreds to even thousands of lineages. So if we step back and looked at all the mitochondrial DNA history of all humans, it would look something like that. A big mess, really. Now, what would the biblical view of mitochondrial history look like? Well, again, remember, we're starting at 6,000 years ago, so we're not talking about very many generations. First of all, the height of the evolutionary tree is thousands of mutations. If we've got 20 20 years per generation, and it was actually longer earlier in Earth history. We're only talking about 300 generations since the beginning. So it would be, and three mutations per, or a generation every three generations, mutation every 3 generations, there we go, would mean we've only got maybe 100 mutations. So whereas the evolutionary tree is going to be thousands high, thousands of mutations high, the biblical history is only going to be 100 high. So it would probably be 100th or even 1,000th the height of the evolutionary tree. Also, according to biblical history, it starts from 2 people, goes up to a flood just 1,600 years later. That's a single lineage, whereas evolution is looking at maybe thousands of lineages. In the biblical time scale, there's only one lineage leading up to the flood. There's only one family that goes through the flood, and they stay together as probably one family unit up until Babel. It's only since Babel, which we think to be about 4,000 years ago, 4,500 years ago, somewhere in there. Population divides into, the biblical account gives us, allows us to estimate the number of families, each of which got a different language. Depending on how you count them, somewhere between 47, 76 families. So whereas we have thousands of individual lineages in evolution, we're only going to have something on order of 47 to 76 lineages, separate lineages in the biblical account of history. And then each of those lineages is going to increase for 134 to 156 generations, which again, dividing that by 3, we're only talking about 40, 50 mutations. So again, we compare basically this is what it would look like. This is what the mitochondrial DNA family tree would look like for humans. First of all humans would go back to a single point, which is representing one female, that would be Eve, and then 1,656 years later, so that many generations, divide that there should be 3 nodes, because there's only, if we assume that Noah's wife didn't bear any more children after they were more 600 years old, then the only females that are bearing children after the flood would have been the 3 wives of the 3 sons of Noah. So for whatever 1,656 years is divided by the number of generations, and there's 10 generations given in Scripture, we're probably only just talking about 3 mutations long branches that lead from Eve to a node. The node is where the descendants of each of the females goes separately into across the world. There would be this many lineages, somewhere between 47 and 76 lineages coming off of those 3 nodes. How they're distributed, Scripture gives us a little bit of information, but let's say to make it simple, we can divide an equal number of lineages from each of these, and this is what the tree would look like. Now for scale, remember, the evolutionary tree is much longer, many generations longer. So if you compare the 2 trees from your distance over there, this is what they look like. Here's the evolutionary tree. The mitochondrial, the rough prediction of an evolutionary mitochondrial DNA tree. Well, where's the biblical one? It's right there. That's the size of it. It's 1/100th or less the height of the evolutionary tree, and it's only got 76 lineages maximum, somewhere in something that's a little dot compared to this. Now there's enough of a difference, I would suggest, between those 2 trees for us to look at the mitochondrial DNA of humans and see which one it fits better. it ought to be easy to tell the difference between them. So what does the actual tree look like? There it is. It looks just roughly at this scale really close to the biblical prediction. It's not a deep, the mitochondrial DNA tree does not show thousands of generations of difference. It shows only a few hundred generations of difference total. Now let's look at this a little more closely. Here's the tree as we predicted it, just a simple view of sort of a model for what it should look like. Evolution says the length of these bars should be thousands of mutations high. Creation prediction, somewhere in the order of 32 to 36 high. That's the difference, the distance between the middle and the outer edge. You would expect no nodes, no common ancestors, at least within the last hundreds of thousands of years, and no geographic pattern. Whereas in the creation model, you should have 3 nodes that are 3 mutations apart from each other. There should be 47 to 76 of these deeply indented trees. And the biblical account suggests, when you look at it carefully, that the 3 sons of Noah divided and went into 3 different directions, roughly corresponding to the 3 different continents there that converge in the Middle East. That Japheth's descendants went Europe, in the direction of Europe. Ham's descendants went in the direction of Africa, and the Shem's descendants went in the direction of Asia. So we might expect that these 3 different nodes correspond to 3 different geographic locations, whereas you wouldn't expect any particular pattern in the evolutionary scenario. So what do we actually find? The actual tree is about 39, almost 40 mutations high, which is a little bit higher than we expected with our simple model, but certainly nowhere close to the evolutionary prediction. There are, in fact, 3 nodes, 3 primary nodes that are about 3.3 mutations apart from each other, which is very close to the biblical prediction. 3 nodes at 3 mutations apart from one another. And there appear to be, it's kind of hard to count them given their different lengths, but there's about 84 primary branches in comparison with a prediction of 47 to 76 in the creation model. And again, thousands in the evolutionary model. It just does not fit the evolutionary model. And the 3 different nodes roughly correspond to 3 different continents. So look more closely at this. The blue represents the lineages that go to Africa, or in Africa. The purple are the lineages that are in Asia. The green are the lineages that are in Europe. And so what you see is, with a few minor exceptions, one of the nodes goes to Africa. Another node and a half, we'll say, goes to Asia, and then the other half node goes to Europe. So there is definitely a geographic division, which is what we'd expect in the creation model. When I laid all this stuff out, and it takes a little bit of work to go through each one of these and find out where each one of these are at and everything, but this is astonishing to me. It shouldn't be, because I know the biblical account is correct, but I didn't expect that things would look this pretty, this close to the creation prediction. On so many levels, human mitochondrial DNA is much more compatible with biblical history than it is with evolutionary history. There's just no comparison. The height of the tree, the number of nodes, the distance the nodes are away from each other, the number of primary branches, all of these things are very close to the description we are given in Scripture, and nowhere close to the evolutionary view of Earth history. So I think we have very powerful confirmation from mitochondrial DNA of the biblical account of human history.